Welcome. It's great to have so many people joining us today for the Pensions Dashboards Preparation webinar. My name is Emma James and I'm one of the Industry Outreach Specialists here at TPR. Today, we'll be focusing on how to get your data dashboards ready by unpicking your data preparation duties and providing clarity on the steps you need to take to ensure your member data is accurate, complete, up-to-date and digitally accessible. I am delighted today to be joined by my colleague Lucy Stone. Lucy heads up our Pensions Dashboards work here at TPR, and Kim Gubler, who's chair at the Pensions Administration Standards Association, PASA. Lucy will give an overview of the legal duties on trustees and scheme managers and working collaboratively with those who play a supporting role. And she'll then look at what good data quality means, outlining TPR's expectations on data quality, helping you to understand what's required for your scheme to meet its pensions dashboard's duties. Kim will be setting out the practical steps on how you can prepare and improve your data as set out in PASA's guidance on administration. The final 30 minutes of today's session will then concentrate on a Q&A. And this is really your opportunity to ask us any questions you may have. And you can start submitting your questions now throughout the session by typing them in the box below this video player. As ever with all of our webinars, please don't worry about capturing all of the information yourself. The slides and a useful links document will be available for you to download after today's session. And there'll also be a free opportunity for you to feedback on the session itself. The survey for this is now available at the top of the menu to the left-hand side of the video player. We'd be grateful if you could fill this out before you leave today, even if you can't stay with us till the end. I'd now like to welcome my colleague, Lucy Stone, Dashboards Lead at TPR, to kick off today's webinar. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Emma. Before I delve into the meat of the seminar, let's just remind ourselves briefly about pensions dashboards. As a result of automatic enrolment, more people than ever are now saving for their retirement. In addition, a change in people's working patterns means savers can build up multiple pensions pots, which can be difficult to track. The Pensions Policy Institute estimates that there are around 2.8 million lost pots, worth over £26 billion or over £9,000 each. Pensions dashboards are digital services, apps, websites, or other tools, which savers will be able to use to see their pension information online and in one place. Dashboards aim to help members plan for retirement by finding their various pensions and reconnecting them with any lost pensions, and understanding the value of their pensions in terms of an estimated retirement income. So in order for dashboards to help savers need to be able to see all their pensions. So pension schemes will have new legal duties. First of all, to connect to a central digital architecture by a certain deadline. Then once connected, the scheme will receive data and use this to search records and see if they have a pension for that person. This is what we call matching. If they find a match, they will need to return to them certain information within specific timeframes. And all of this will need to be done in line with standards set by the Money and Pension Service. In February, government announced that more time is needed to build the digital architecture, and as a result, the deadlines and legislation will be changing. But connection is only one piece of the dashboard's puzzle, and while the deadlines are shifting, schemes must continue with their preparations, in particular around data. Think of the delays as an opportunity to get ahead of the game or catch up if you're struggling to get ready in time. As a starting point, you should be reading our dashboard's guidance, which includes a handy checklist that you can use to make sure you get and stay on track. We will also provide links to other guidance and materials you might find useful. So that's the background. Now let's focus in on our topic for the day, data. Data is not just a dashboard issue. Data is the lifeblood of a pension scheme. You need data to make sure you're paying the right person, the right pension at the right time, which is, after all, the very reason pensions exist. But having good data is important for the smooth running of a scheme more generally. To make sure you can accurately calculate your liabilities for a DB pension scheme, for example, or process core financial transactions promptly for a DC scheme. So I want to take some time to reiterate our expectations as a regulator of trustees in respect of data. First of all, know your data. What data do you need to run your scheme? Some elements are pretty standard, such as member identifiers, and that's what we call common data. Other elements depend on the structure of the benefits you offer, so whether you offer DB or DC benefits, and some of the complexities, such as whether you operate an underpin. But that data also depends on what your strategic objectives are. So for example, if you're looking to de-risk a DB scheme, you might need to collect additional data. So these variations in terms of scheme type and strategic objectives define what we call scheme-specific data. Now you know your data, you should be reviewing this at least annually. And when you assess your data, it's not enough to see if data is present, i.e. that there is a field in the box. You also need to be confident that it's right. There are several ways you can test data, and you should be talking to your administrators. For example, you can reasonably expect all administrators will do some consistency tests. So, for example, checking that the date of leaving a scheme is after the date of joining a scheme for a specific member. Other things that your administrator may be looking at is whether data is unique. You wouldn't expect two members to have the same national insurance number, and while you can expect a few people to share the same date of birth, it's unlikely that large numbers of your members would. In summary, you should be working with your administrator to be confident that they've got the right processes in place to make sure your data is of sufficient quality. When reviewing your data, your administrator will typically prepare a data quality report for you, and that will give you a percentage of members that your administrator has data for, which is complete and likely to be of good quality. But you need to look further than the score. So let's say I've got a score of 95%, but what problems are the 5% where there isn't complete and accurate data? What problems is that causing me? How big of a risk is this to members? And where there are issues, what should I be prioritizing to improve? So the data report is the beginning of a conversation with your administrator and leads you to create an improvement plan to make sure you improve data where you need to. Finally, as they say, data is for life, not just for Christmas. Your administrator needs to have the right controls in place to ensure the accuracy of your data on an ongoing basis. And you should have all this captured and written down, ideally in a data management plan. Now, having said it's not just about dashboards, dashboards do raise the stakes. So let's look at the dashboard specific considerations. I mentioned that dashboards raise the bar. What do I mean? Well, first of all, there are technical considerations you haven't necessarily had before. First of all, data needs to be digitally accessible. It has to be held on an IT system in a way that it can be searched and transmitted. So for example, a benefit value held on a scanned copy of a letter isn't digital enough if you can't retrieve that value without human intervention. And second of all, your data has to be in a certain format set by the Money and Pensions Service so it can be transmitted. The other element which is important is that the data you must provide must meet certain rules on how it is calculated. For C scheme, this is in line with ASTM1, which is changing. So you need to implement the changes to those rules. And for DB scheme, data needs to be in line with SCI rules. And all this data has to be sufficiently recent. You can't just send a value calculated at leaving 5 years ago. It has to be from roughly the last 13 months. If it all seems complicated, it's because it is, but we provide guidance, as do PASA. And I'm going to hand over to Kim to take us through the work of the Dashboards Working Group and what they are doing to help.
Great, thanks very much, Lucy. Well, as Lucy said, it is complicated, and that's one of the reasons why the Pensions Dashboard Working Group actually got together. A lot of the decisions you've got to make are based on very technical bits of information, and you have to look at it at a very granular level. So PAS has brought together a cross-industry working group with lots of subject matter experts, and they're all able to put their experience to bear to make sure that some of the decisions that you've got to make are actually, they're quite common. And so you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel for every single scheme. So it's looking at the governance. What do you need to do, and think about how administrators are going to be interacting with trustees, data matching, and understanding that data, the pensions values that you're going to put together, and also some of the operational issues, which as a trustee you may not have a direct influence and control over, but you need to be aware of. That PAS has also got recently put together 2 subgroups, and that's specifically looking at the saver experience and also at scheme configuration. And they are drilling down at an even more technical level, and there'll be guidance coming out from there too. So the last point that I would really say is, bearing in mind everything at the moment is still on a very theoretical level. And it's why it's so important to be as ready as possible, because once we get past the dashboard's available point, that's when the real testing will come into play. And Lucy's going to take you through some of the responsibilities. So I will hand over to her now, the data matching criteria.
Okay, let's talk about matching. The system will provide you certain data. The list is here on the slide, and more detail is available in our guidance and on MAPS's website. Some of these elements will be verified by an identity service, while others will simply be provided by the user. You need to decide which elements you will use to search your records. We expect a lot of industry will end up using PAS's matching convention, which Kim will talk about shortly. But this will not be suitable for everyone. It's dependent on the quality of your data. In simple terms, if you're not confident in the quality of your national insurance numbers, you shouldn't use those to match. This brings me to the second point here. Your criteria may very well change, so building on the example of a scheme who has concerns about its national insurance numbers. While you might not use them for matching at first, you will be putting plans in place to improve that data. And where you are confident that your national insurance numbers are now of good quality, you can review your matching criteria and include them. You will need to keep a record of your matching policy, i.e., which criteria you have chosen and why. And you will need to define 2 sets of criteria. One for matches made, i.e., the bar which needs to be met for you to think, yeah, that's Lucy Stone, I'll send on her value information. But there is also something called a possible match. Put simply, you think you have Lucy Stone, but you aren't fully confident. Perhaps you have an L Stone, or the date of birth or Nino are 1 digit off. In that case, you want to be able to return something through dashboard which says, Lucy, we think we have a pension for you. Give us a call to provide more details so we can confirm. And that is great for you as a scheme, because if you are concerned about your data and you are worried about sending the wrong person information, possible matching allows you to navigate that. You aren't sending value information, just contact details so they can get in touch, and you can achieve the confidence you need to share the data. But equally, you don't want to tell every single person called Stone to call you. So you need criteria to decide how to identify those who might have a pension with you, the possible matches. And this possible match criteria also needs to be captured. The other thing you should think about is where you have multiple sections, and there might be discrepancies in data quality between these sections. Then it might be suitable to have more than one set of matching criteria. Now back to Kim, who can talk to us about the thinking PASA has done on matching and how to improve the data quality of personal data as those two go hand in hand.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Well, looking at the data matching itself, PASA basically produced the data matching convention paper, which was updated last year, but we're just imminently going to issue an addendum to that, and that is covering the more detailed areas of when you haven't got a national insurance number, or when you've got possible matches that you want to put together. So, as Lucy said, data is core to absolutely everything. So we'll be looking here at sort of core guidance for the criteria for matching. And all of those are based on your level of confidence in the data that you hold. So your administrator, you would expect to be able to come to you and say, these are the areas that you should be using for data matching. However, you have to be comfortable that that is right for your scheme. And if it isn't right for your scheme, you can choose additional data matching criteria. What I would say there is there might be some element of negotiation with your administrator on that, because it would be outside of their core operations. One of the things within this addendum is what to do about not having a national insurance number. Now, that might be that you have low confidence in the national insurance numbers that you hold, but because it's not one of the verified data aspects that will be verified within the digital architecture, it might be that the user doesn't actually key it in at all, although they will maybe be asked to do so. Or it might be that they make a mistake and they transpose some things. Basically, or they might be a non-UK resident. There's lots of reasons why you might not have a national insurance number. I was speaking to a scheme the other day, and they said they had 100% confidence in the national insurance number. And they were devastated to find out that actually, even though they had that high level of confidence, that they might not be able to use that. So you have those, you have the match made, as we would say, sort of, that's when you're absolutely certain that this is the person that you have as a member. And then you might need to have something what they call the fuzzy matches. And that's where you can use other pieces of data to determine whether or not to move that into a match made or a possible match. Because you need to, say, for example, decide whether you're going to allow for blank spaces. If somebody's put 2 spaces or when they're keying in, or if there's been a keying error within the administration database, just on the level of that kind of thing. But you also need to maybe think about if someone's made an obvious typo, so Smith with TH transposed. There's lots of things like that you can use where you can say, actually, I can take that as a potential without thinking about having false positives. Because when you're talking about false positives, you could, for example, use last name, first name, and postcode. And if you do frequent address traces, then the chances of having lots of false positives are probably lower. But if you just used first and last name and date of birth, you're quite likely to have high numbers of false positives, and that would be a very bad thing. What you need to be careful of is too many of the possible matches, which, as Lucy said, that's when they say, hi, I think it's you, please contact. That is entirely feasible that could, too many of them will put pressure on your administration operations. If that happens, then all of the things that they do for you may be put under pressure. And I suppose one of the last things is when you're thinking, people think of addresses as something quite straightforward, but actually it's because we're human and we understand that if a postcode, if there's a blank line and then the postcode, we know that that's the case. But machines, when you're actually talking about, because that's how the match criteria is going to be, they have a lot of difficulty in understanding what's a material difference as opposed to not. And that would then have to go through. So all the way through, we're talking about the level of confidence that you have in your specific scheme's data. And that is both your common data and your scheme-specific data. So when we move on to that, it is about the level of confidence that you have in your data. And last year, in the summertime, the data working group issued the dashboard's data accuracy guidance. There's far too many D's in that for me. And that comes back down to really looking at the data. All schemes should have a data management plan. They should have data validation as part of that plan. And there should be an element of iteration in that. As Lucy said, data isn't just for Christmas. So you need to think about ways that you might be able to improve that data as part of your data management plan. You could be using shared data, for example, land registry, but knowing that there's some issues with that, and it's not always going to be perfect. Public data records like your electoral roll, and then private data like BT data services. I think it's something along the lines of like the telephone directory, but a bit more detailed. So it is all about that active management of your data, and using and speaking to your administrator about the different techniques that you can use to verify that the data that you've got is not only exists, but it's accurate and it represents the most up-to-date iteration for your member. And last year in the summertime, the PASA data working group actually issued some guidance on the data that you need for and the accuracy for dashboards. But just for a moment, let's sort of step aside and say data isn't just about dashboards, because under the UK GDPR, you are obliged to have as accurate data as possible for your scheme. So everything really should be coming together. Dashboards is a watershed moment for UK pension schemes, and probably things won't be the same again. And that's one of the reasons why we need to really look at our data on a granular level. We need to have a data management plan. And within that data management plan, we need to look at data validation, the fundamental part of it, looking at existence and accuracy side by side. There are lots of ways that you can look at improving the data, not just relying on users going through dashboards and correcting their own data. You've got the public data, which is land registry. It's not perfect, but as part of validation, it's great. And then you've got the shared data. You've got the electoral roll, and you can also have private data, which is like BT directory solutions. They're a bit more accurate, but if you can combine all of those things together, you get this enriched data. And that's when you can, not just for dashboards, as Lucy was saying, going back to what is it that you want to do with your scheme. But you do need to think about not just looking at data at a sort of one and done. Actually need to think about that iteration, how you're going to improve the data for dashboards, but also for you and your members going forward. Now I'm going to hand over to Lucy, because basically what she's going to take you through is when you've matched that member, what you show to them in terms of their value.
Right, so you've been through matching and you've found a member, and you will need to return data to them when they request it. Some data you will need to return immediately. Administrative data, which is information about the scheme and how to contact you, and signpost data, information on costs and charges, which is already on your website, for example. Then there is value data, basically how much pension a person has built up to date and how much they are projected to have at retirement. This data will depend on the benefit type, and in most cases, you'll need to provide both projected and accrued values. Alongside value data is contextual data, information which helps a member make sense of the values. So, for example, what is the effective date as the value? Would the value increase in retirement? Is there spouse's benefit attached? Now, let's talk about what good quality data means for these different elements. Your administrative data has to be accurate. So, for example, provide the right contact number so your member can reach you. As we've mentioned, value data needs to be calculated in line with legal requirements, so ASTM1 for DC benefit and scheme rules for DB benefit. And it also needs to be sufficiently recent. It has to be based on a statement provided in the last 13 months, or it has to have been calculated in the last 12 months. The contextual information you provide has to be sufficient to help your members make sense of the value information you've sent. And all this information has to be digitized so it can be returned through the digital architecture. Alongside matching, value data is where most of the work lies for you and your administrator. You only have a short time to provide this data. If you have provided it to the member within the last year, you have to return it through dashboards instantly. If not, you have 3 days to calculate the value and return it for DC benefit, or 10 days for DB benefit. So it's in your interest to talk to your administrator about how much of this you can front load. For example, can you revalue in bulk or even automate the calculation of benefits? So it's only a small number of cases you have to calculate within the 3 and 10 days. Value data is also where you need to make decisions on what to show. And sometimes you will face slightly complicated issues, which is where I hand back to Kim.
Great, thanks, Lucy. I think what you've come to think about here is once you've actually matched to the right person, what are you going to show them? How are you going to show them? Lucy's talked about what your regulatory responsibilities are. But thinking about this, think of deferred benefits, defined benefit. You don't have to send benefit statement out. So although you can give them any value in the last 13 months, you might not have provided a value in the last 13 months. So you may need to change your processes, and administrators are all building in to their operational models how they're going to go about that. On your defined contribution, if you've got DC scheme, yes, you do have to send out annual SMPI statements, but a lot of those actually aren't digitized. So you've got to think about how you're going to hold that data. You've got to think about whether you're going to calculate every time that a user comes through to dashboards and gets matched to a member of your scheme. Are you going to calculate it? Are you going to do a run through once a month, once every 6 months? All of these things you need to think about, but they are dependent on the level of confidence that you have in your data and how automated your scheme's calculations are. It's not all about DB. You've got DC schemes with DB underpins, like, for example, steel schemes with GMP underpins. You've got split administration. So you might have one scheme with a DC section and a DB section. How are you going to show that data together? A lot of DB schemes, although they may be closed to future accrual, have still got their ABC providers. Do you take a regular data feed from the ABC provider? And if you don't, how are you going to show that ABC value? Because it is the trustee's responsibility to do so. So our guidance notes, it's over 80 pages long. And we completely understand how difficult that might be to try and tease out the bits that might be relevant for you. So PASRA is looking at how we can show that on our website so that you can get to what's important to you quickly. So just coming back to this value data, what you want to make sure is that your member, once you've matched them, that you give them information that is useful for them. What you don't want is you don't want past the dashboard available point, lots of people not understanding the data that they've got. so that they're contacting your administrator. So we will later be providing guidance that will help both administrators and schemes in that conundrum. But next month, what you want to look out for is this value data guidance, because I can tell you now that there are probably things in there that you haven't thought of. And I'm going to hand back to Lucy now, who's going to take you through the 4 key steps that you need to take.
Last slide, I promise, and then we can get on with the Q&A. Let's finish with your action list. What should you be doing now? First of all, make sure you understand the data you will receive from the digital architecture and the data you will need to return to members and by when. Assess the current quality of your data, but also its digital accessibility. Consider which data items you are going to use for matching, and consider how are you going to present and calculate the value of your data to make sure you can return it within instantly or within 3 or 10 days. And put a plan in place to improve the quality of your data and to maintain the quality of this data. That's it for the presentation. We will now give you a couple of minutes to submit your questions. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I can see we've had a lot of questions come in, so I'll get us started straight away. Our first question is for Lucy. As a trustee, how do I decide what data fields are appropriate for my scheme in order for our members to find their information? And what if there is missing data?
So thank you very much for that. Hopefully I've touched on some of that earlier, but effectively you'll know what data you're going to get from the system, and you can go to our guidance if you need a reminder. And you should be working with your administrator to understand what data you hold and the quality of that data. And you should be defining the data you're going to use for match based on that quality against the fields, the data you're going to be receiving. So, for example, if you have concerns around national insurance numbers, then you shouldn't really be using those for matching. But what you can do is put a plan in place to improve your data. In terms of what you should be doing if you're missing data, so if it's data that you want to use to match, you should be trying to fill it. Again, there's a lot of guidance out there on techniques you can use to update data. You'll work with your employer. That's a huge source of data for you. And your administrator is going to be key to helping you improve your data to make sure it's fit for purpose. Just a reminder, your data matching is iterative. So as your data improves, you'll be able to use different fields for matching if you feel that's appropriate.
Some great insight there. Let's launch into our second question. This is for Kim, and this comes from James in Brighton. How do I know what value information to return to members? What if they have a number of other benefits, such as AVC arrangements? And how is this presented to members?
Okay, fine. Well, obviously, we've already got both guidance and the standards that you have to return. Now, the thing is, clearly you've got DB benefit and DC benefit. If you've potentially got sort of members with either AVCs, or if you've got split benefits, a scheme that's got 2 sections, DB and DC section, then you need to look at the value information that you've got to return more closely. There's not a specific for both when you've got DB and DC, whether that's AVCs or just sort of pure DC, there's no specific to it. So you've got sort of 3 options. You can actually provide the information side by side and linked. You can provide it separately and linked, or you can provide it separately and unlinked. But you have to sort of bear in mind, if you provide it separately and unlinked, that's not really giving a good user experience. So generally, but not always, you might have a different administrator for both DB and DC. But clearly what you need to be doing is engaging with your administrators to seeing what data they can give you. For AVCs, you might find that some of that information it could be provided on a on call basis, or it might be that you need to have sort of data feeds coming in. So there isn't a one size fits all to that, but what you really, really need to be doing is engaging, seeing what plans for connection the separate provider might have. Obviously, much more simple if it's all within the same provider.
Fantastic. And just leading on from that, Ryan Grotkin has asked, when can we expect further guidance as to how trustees should be dealing with AVCs?
Well, therein lies. That's great, because the one of the passive subgroups has sort of produced an 80-page, very technical document on all of the different sort of value data that you can provide. It is far too granular to go through now. It will be launched. I'm very hopeful it will be launched in, early next month. It's going through the final iterations now. So it's in its final draft form. What we're looking to do is to get it onto the PASA website in such a way that it's more user-friendly, searchable. In the first instance, it's likely to be a whole document, but there's some really good collateral in there that I think is going to be helpful to schemes.
Oh, fantastic.
Sorry, can I just come in briefly on that? I mean, our guidance makes it clear that you should be talking to your AVC provider and making sure that they're on track for everything they need to do, as well as your main administrator. But our guidance generally is iterative. So as we find out more about people's experience and practice, we will update it as we go along. So, you know, I'm not saying we won't provide more guidance. We're trying to learn from what people's experiences in practice and make sure you get the benefit of what we're learning.
Fantastic. Now, next question is from Julia, and she's asking, is there a quality assessment available for her to compare the scheme's data to for what is expected for pensions dashboards?
So there isn't a general, sorry, I assumed that was for me.
It was, sorry.
But actually, Kim might want to come in on this. I mean, there isn't a standard template that says, you know, this is how you compare yourself. Again, it comes back to talking to your administrator and asking them what is the quality of the data that you know you will be receiving for matching, and then a conversation about how you improve it. Some administrators have started offering an assessment, a dashboard readiness assessment already, so it might be your administrator already offers that. But I would say go to your administrator, ask them how can they help you compare your data. There isn't a standard template available.
You're absolutely right, Lucy. There isn't a standard template available. Engaging with your administrator is really important. You might find some of the smaller administrators may be sort of waiting in the background to see to do that learning piece, and I think that's only natural. But certainly, sort of from a passive perspective, we will sort of continue to ensure that the collateral that and guidance that we put out really helps people in that sort of, what's expected. The data guidance, dashboards data guidance that came out from our dashboards working group last year really helps people sort of understand that the sort of quality of the scheme data that is expected and how that might differ from ordinary ongoing administration data.
Thanks for that. Our next question, again, this is for Lucy, is why is Nino not a mandatory field? The volume of possible matches that might be returned there, that's just of concern there for Samantha.
Right, so first of all, can I explain what we mean by Nino not being a mandatory field? So effectively, when a user logs into a dashboard, they will have to provide some data. Some of it will be mandatory, so they can't proceed effectively without filling that box. Some of that data will be verified by an identity verification service, so you'll be able to be confident that their name and their date of birth and possibly their current address is right. But Nino is not going to be verified, nor is it going to be mandatory. So technically, someone could proceed to search their records without a Nino. And the reason that is that not everyone has a Nino, for one thing, or they may not have it in hand. So a lot of people are concerned that Nino is used by a lot of schemes to match. And therefore, if they don't have it, does that make matching really difficult? Or you can have large volumes of possible matches? It's important to know that the Pensions Dashboard Programme, who's building the technology, has been looking at this in testing, and in practice, people do provide a national insurance number when they are asked, even if it's not mandatory. It's something they will keep an eye on as well, as the technology is built and we have people using it with live data. What they've tested so far are prototypes. They'll continue keeping an eye on that. It is strongly encouraged, so you'll be encouraged not to proceed without providing an ENO and being told if you don't provide an ENO, you might struggle to find things. And of course, if we find that large volumes of people are not providing it, then there's no reason that the data standard can't change. But as we said, in practice, the experience is that people do provide it, so it may not be mandatory, but you should be receiving it.
Can I just pop in there, Lucy? Also, sort of, you may have seen that yesterday ASSA produced an addendum. It's quite an important addendum to the data matching guidance. And that's one of the key areas that covered was with how to do matching without a national insurance number. Because people might provide the national insurance number, but they might they might transpose sort of figures. So also the guidance talks to how you can use certain transpositions where you can move from sort of possible match into a match made, and where you really need to sort of go further and dig down. So because it's not verifiable, that's why it's not one of the mandatory fields. But as Lucy said, it is feasible that as experience and time goes on, that might be added to it. But you will have support, and there is guidance now out there to help you in that task.
Thanks, Kim. Our next question is for Lucy, and this comes from Ian. Dashboards regulation is aimed at trustees and providers, but do you have a view as to whether employers are also stakeholders in the success of dashboards?
That's a very good question, Ian. Yes, they absolutely are. And there's two reasons why employers are important. One is, in the immediate term, employers are the primary source of data for administrators and schemes, personal data in particular. Employers is how you get information when someone is enrolled into a scheme on their national insurance number, their date of birth, their name, especially with the advent of automatic enrollment. So employer is very important for personal data. It's also obviously important for other things like contribution data, which is critical. So employers have a key role to play in ensuring that they're providing the right data to schemes. That's the first area where they are critical to the success of dashboards. The other area, which is more about looking into the future, is as dashboards are preparing to go live and they're ready to be used by savers day to day, is how do you get the word out? How do you get the word out to savers that dashboards exist? And their employers might have a role to play, because actually they have communications with their employees and sometimes with the people who retired from the company, and they are able to sort of promote and make people aware of dashboards as part of their conversations. So two parts to that, and employers are important.
Fantastic, thank you, Lucy. And just leading on, there is a question from Paul. How can the industry encourage disengaged trustees to improve their data quality as part of PDP? For some smaller schemes, this could be cost prohibitive in the short term, but great value in the long term. And that's aimed at you, Kim.
Oh, that's a great question, Paul. Thanks very much for that. It is a perennial question, but effectively, I think a lot of, if we're talking about DB trustees here as opposed to DC trustees for a moment, we'll just move on to DC. One of the things to look at is, I think as Lucy has said during the actual presentation, is the scheme specific data will be critical for the trustees' journey plan and how they want to get there. So if they're actually looking to have some kind of insured outcome, then they need to be looking at their data now. And if they're looking at their data now, they should be effectively looking at it for dashboards. You don't want to keep on coming back and doing little sort of chipping away at a dashboard, at a data project. What you can do is you can say, well, strategically, where are we going to? Okay, we might be 3-5 years from buyout. What can we do now? Because then you'll be, like you were saying, sort of in the longer term, that will have much greater value. So what you need to do is you need to find the hook for that specific board of trustees. Ultimately, they have a regulatory responsibility. GDPR basically says that data has to be current and up to date and accurate. So, you've got the regulatory side, but that's almost always been there. But in terms of encouraging, it's about integrating that data sort of requirements into the whole data management plan. And just touching on sort of DC, now clearly quite a few of those will be, they could be sort of active schemes with, like Lucy was saying, with active contributions flowing in. So there, what you can do is you can say, right, well, there would be more connection between the scheme and the employer to be able to do that. So they can do it much more cost effectively.
Can I just add on that for DC scheme as well? It's worth reflecting if you're a small DC scheme and you don't feel you're able to improve the data and therefore provide savers the service they deserve. Really, I think that forms part of your your question about, am I providing value for my savers? Would they be better off in another arrangement? Should I be thinking about that as well?
Completely agree.
Thanks both. Our next question is from Lucy, and it comes from Brian. And Brian asks, if I'm reliant on third-party providers for most of the work involved in getting connected, matching and returning information to our members, if something goes wrong, will I, as a trustee, be liable for any breaches when I've outsourced this work?
That's a good question, Brian. So ultimately, the legal duties are placed on trustees. And it's really important that, just because you've asked someone else to do the work, you have not absolved yourself of those responsibilities. But we recognise that in practice, someone else is going to be doing the work day to day. And where it's really important there is for you to put the right controls in place. So you should be thinking, we've got some guidance on appointing, selecting and managing providers. You should be following that. You should make sure that you understand clearly what people are doing and that there's good reporting mechanisms and that you've taken all the steps you can to make sure they are doing what they should be doing. And in that circumstance, that's the kind of thing we would look at as well, is, have you done what you should be doing in terms of setting the right controls? Now, if something goes wrong, and you've done what you should be doing, and it is the liability, the responsibility, the reason you've breached the legislation is because of the actions of the third parties, we will actually have something called a third party power. So we will be able to take action against the third party if we consider they've caused you to breach. So the answer is you may be liable, but it depends on the circumstances. The point is to focus on making sure that you're doing all the things you should be doing. And if it's outside of your control, then we have the ability to engage and go for the third party.
Could I just sort of interject here as well? A lot of trustees should be also engaging with their lawyers. I know that's another expense, but actually it's a very important oversight, because what you need to be looking at is what needs to be added to the contract. So on that third party, say it's an administrator, dashboards won't be part of the schedule, but all of the data protection, cybersecurity, all of that should still be, just making sure that that's all there and fit for purpose as it is now. So it would be sensible to be starting to having those conversations, first of all, with the administrator, and then when you feel comfortable that it's in a fit state to be reviewed, then to have that sort of updated, that contract updated.
Fantastic, thanks both. Our next question is for Lucy again. This comes from Caroline, and she asks, who is responsible for regulating where there is a crossover of regulators for certain things? For example, if there's a data breach.
Right, excellent question, Caroline. So I think there's two areas where people are thinking about possible crossovers. One is the crossover between us and the FCA. That is relatively clear cut because effectively FCA regulates the duties of personal pension scheme providers. We regulate the duties of occupational pension scheme providers. So we shouldn't be regulating the same pension schemes. So that's easy. There will be times where we might be speaking to the same people because, for example, their personal pension scheme provider might be an administrator to one of our schemes. And we will make sure that we, communicate and coordinate when we take action. Data breach is an interesting one because obviously data GDPR is regulated by the Information Commissioner's Office, but we have a strongly interest in it as well because if you don't have the right data controls in place, that is a breach of internal controls. So effectively, potentially we might both be interested. But where these things happen, it's really important to know that we work closely with the other regulators. We would have a conversation. We might talk about who's most appropriate to take action. At the end of the day, both the Information Commissioner's Office and TPR want to achieve the best outcome for savers. So we wouldn't, and we have to be proportionate and we're trying to drive good outcomes. So you would expect it might be unreasonable, for example, to both take action and we would think these things through. Now, you can find out a little bit more. We actually put in a bit of language to that effect in our recent compliance and enforcement policy consultation. So if you want to find out more about how we work with the ICO, I would go and give that a look.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lucy. Our next question is for Kim, and this comes from Cliff. So Cliff asks, what sources can we go to in order to find missing data? We have a lot of deferred members with no address or no NANOs.
Goodness, right. Okay, then. Well, have a look at the dashboard's data accuracy guidance that the dashboards the data working group, the data working group put out. I think it was July of last year. And in that, it's basically takes you through the sort of shared data, the public data and private data sources, which you can go to. Now, clearly you can outsource this job, but that will be dependent on your budget. But if things like shared data, land registry, current account turnover, public data, electoral register, insolvency service, things like that, or private data, you've got BT Directory Solutions, which is effectively, so I wouldn't say one of those on their own would be adequate, but if you're using sort of multiple sources, clearly some of the specialist firms, data firms, can help, but it isn't mandatory that you have to use one. You can just use these data sources. But just recognizing that for example, shared data is not perfect, and it sort of goes down in that sense. So the more private, probably more expensive, that will be the most accurate.
Thanks, Kim. Our next question is for Lucy, and it's from Deborah. Deborah asks, is there a checklist of what I need to do to make sure I retain correct records?
So there isn't a checklist per se, Deborah, but if you go on our website, we have guidance on, what records you should be keeping, how you review records, how you improve records, and it links to other guidance put out by, for example, PASA as well. I believe we'll be issuing, after this webinar, we'll be issuing a document which has useful links, and the link to that guidance is in that document, so you can use that to go and find out more information.
It is indeed, Lucy. Our next question is for Kim again. This comes from Laik, and Laik asks, can schemes choose their own matching criteria, in addition to any personal data such as national insurance, date of birth, surname, for example, employer or date left?
Well, the thing is, clearly the more data that you use in your matching criteria, probably the more likelihood you're going to get a match made, but also the higher the bar, that's more likely that someone you can get people that don't have that information. So what you're trying to find is the best compromise, and when you're choosing your matching criteria, it really is just down to the level of confidence you've got in your data. So you know, you need to be comfortable that the criteria that you use are appropriate for your scheme, for your membership. Ultimately, what we have is, say, for example, if you were going to use, I've written it down here actually because it's quite sort of interesting, because matching is very algorithmic. If you were to use, say, last name, first name, current postcode, and you've got a lot of confidence in the sort of the addresses that you've got, then your risk of false positives are going to be less. But say, for example, if you use first name, last name, and date of birth, then the risk of false positives is going to be higher. And clearly, the criteria that you're looking, they're not in the mandatory field. So you've got to make sure that the matching criteria that you use is appropriate to you, and that you're actually going to get it. Because if it's not in a find request, then it's pointless you having it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kim. This is our penultimate question. This goes to Lucy. What are the panel's thoughts, expectations on providing accrued benefits for new entrants via the dashboard? For DB, there will be 10-day service, and for DC, it's unlikely the first contribution will have been made within the 3-day window. Are values of £0 acceptable?
Right. You're putting me on the spot there a bit, because I'm not sure I recall this off the top of my head, but there are specific requirements in legislation around new starters. So you have a certain period of time before you need to be able to match them. And then you've got longer before you provide a value. I can't recall, but I have a feeling it's something like 3 months before you can match them, and possibly up to a year before you have to provide value for specifically this reason. So if someone's just started, you are not expected to be able to return a value, even if that value is 0. This is all in our guidance. So if you go and look at our guidance under what value to return or what information to return, it sets out exactly what those timelines are. So don't use what I've said as the definitive advice. Do go and check. But there are definitely, you get a period of grace effectively for both finding them, and then a longer one for providing value information.
Yeah, if I could just sort of interject there, you know, there are codes for when values are not yet available. And clearly sort of the values that you will provide, they are rounded anyway. So say if it was, you know, £10, you know, it's not going to be terribly sort of useful. So you're not being expected to do the impossible sort of here. I think it is basically a year there or thereabouts before you need to provide a value.
Fantastic, thank you. And for our final question today, this comes from Ellie, and Ellie asks, what does digitising the information mean? For example, if a benefit statement is held electronically in PDF format, perhaps on a member portal app, does that count as being digital?
So that really depends as to whether that information is searchable. Effectively, you will need to be able to return, you know, in a certain data standard, the value information. If your system is capable of scanning that benefit statement, extracting the value and submitting it to dashboards, sure. But actually, in most cases, a statement that's just scanned in PDF format is not searchable. So it's all about, it has to be held in a digital format, but in a manner that is searchable, retrievable, and you can send to the dashboard.
Yeah, absolutely. I just sort of agree that, you know, a lot of information that may be held electronically is not digitally searchable. So that's another question to be asking your administrator. You know, just what format this information is held in, and can it be extracted?
Fantastic. Thanks, both of you. So that was the last question we had time for today, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you all for joining us and for sending in your questions. I hope you found the session useful and informative. As mentioned earlier, the slides will be made available for you to download, along with our useful links document, and a recording of the webinar will be available for you to watch again in a few days' time. We really appreciate your feedback, so please do complete the survey and have your say. As a reminder, you can find this in the menu to the top left, and it will also now have popped up in the box on the right. And so for now, it's goodbye from us all.